Hi, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and we're here today with an open house discussion featuring Professor David Elmer of Harvard University, and we have some very cherished and well-known members of our community with us today too. We're so glad you all joined us. Thanks for coming. Thanks so much. So I just want to introduce Dave a little bit further. So David Elmer is a member of Harvard's classics faculty since 2007. He holds a PhD from Harvard's Department of Comparative Literature. He's an associate curator of the Milman Parry collection of oral literature, something on which I hope we'll bring you back to talk about on another occasion.
Love
and you're also a member of the Standing Committee on Degrees in Folklore and Mythology. You teach a broad range of courses on history and the interpretation of Greek literature at both undergraduate and graduate levels, and your topics of current research include the Homeric poems, the ancient novel, South Slavic oral epic song, just to name a few. Your most recent book, The Poetics of Consent, Collective Decision-Making and the Iliad, was published in 2013 by Johns Hopkins University Press. It's a masterpiece, so I highly encourage people to read it. And so today we're going to be talking about this idea of consent in the Iliad with a focus on a particular word, right? So can you talk a little bit about that and tell us about your...
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And let me just start by saying that I haven't really prepared any written formal remarks. I just thought I would talk through some of the key ideas from my book with reference to a couple of passages from the Iliad, and I think at least some of the people listening in on this conversation have seen some of those passages, so we can kind of talk through those.
Right. And just hold on, Dave, can I just say one thing? So since we do have some people who are watching our live stream, I just want to share what those focus passages are quickly. So we're talking about Iliad Scroll 1, lines 9 through 25, Iliad 3, Scroll 3, lines 455 through 467.
Actually, Claudia, one small correction. It's Scroll 3, line 455 through Scroll 4, line 67.
Oh, I see what happened. Okay, I misunderstood.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, so that's a nice chunk there.
Well, actually, there's only about 461 lines in Scroll 3, so it's not that big a chunk.
Okay. And then we're going on to Scroll 18, lines 249 through 313, Iliad 23, lines 532 through 542, and one final focus passage from Iliad Scroll 24. I'm really looking forward to this part of the discussion. Lines 723 through 776. All of this is posted, if you didn't catch it, on the Hour 25 website, and the post associated with this discussion, the CHS Open House discussion with David Elmer. Okay, David, thanks so much. Please go ahead.
Great. It's really my pleasure to be with you all and to have this opportunity to talk about my book, which Claudia very generously and perhaps with a touch of hyperbole referred to as a masterpiece. I'm fond of it, but I wouldn't go that far.
No. I stand by my epithet.
I recommend it. Oh, look at that. There it is. What a beautiful cover. Thank you, Jack. Yes, as Claudia mentioned, this is a study that really is rooted in a study of a single word in the Iliad, which is this verb epaineîn. I will use kind of the infinitive and the contracted infinitive form, epaineîn, which is a verb that actually usually in archaic Greek poetry is translated to mean something like to praise. So for example, in the poetry of Pindar, the great epinician praise poet, this is one of the key words that signals what Pindar's poetry does, which is to praise or celebrate an athletic victor. The word actually has a very interesting meaning and strictly circumscribed context in the Iliad. And there it occurs strictly in the context of what I've termed collective decision-making scenes in which a group of people are confronted with some question that requires a decision of some kind, and they have to figure out how they're going to act in this situation. And this verb, epaineîn, signals the collective approval of the group for some proposal. And I would say the foundation of my book, which happens really in chapter 1, is the analysis of a system of different formulas that describe the responses of groups in these collective decision-making contexts. And it turns out that some responses are more effective than others. That is, some responses signal that that a proposal has been rejected. For example, when an audience is simply silent after a proposal is made, it's a signal, and it's an obvious signal, really, that that proposal doesn't have any support. But then there are some slightly more effective responses. So there is a kind of a scale, and at the top end of the scale is this response characterized by this verb epaineîn, which is actually the only, let's say, fully effective response. Proposals that receive one of these intermediate responses typically fail in the long term. So it's really only the proposal that receives this epaineîn response, which I have sort of glossed as being the response of consensus, that the verb signals that consensus has been achieved. It's only proposals that are really greeted with this kind of consensus that are actually successful in the long term. So that is in chapter 1 I outlined that system. One of the interesting things, as a side note, is that there are actually different responses that characterize the Achaeans and the Trojans, and this is a kind of indication that there are some, let's say, political differences between the Achaean community and the Trojan community.
And you also point out some differences between how the Olympian gods.
That's right. Although
decisions, right?
So right, I conduct my analysis of Iliadic political communities in terms of 3 different communities: the Achaeans, the Trojans, and the Olympians, let's call them that. They tend to behave more like the Achaeans. That is, the ideal response for them is this epaineîn response, this response of consensus. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of the ideal around which the Achaean and the Olympian political communities are organized. Right. In Troy, things work differently, although if we have time, we'll look at one very interesting passage where the Trojans have their momentary experience of consensus, except it's a very bad, flawed, let's say, consensus for the Trojans. The Trojans kind of never get it right, you know. I outline this kind of try to outline the system of responses and to sketch the differences between these 2 political communities in the early chapters of the book. Now, I think it's important, before we get to the passages themselves, I want to just sketch kind of where the argument in the book is headed, because so far everything I've said bears strictly kind of on the representation of politics in the poem. And so you might think that this is a book about you know, the politics of Homeric society. But ultimately, what I was really interested in writing this book was in understanding the way that participants in the tradition that produced the Iliad, the oral tradition, understood the development and operation, the workings of that tradition. So the long-term argument in the book is that the representation of politics in the Iliad is actually, and I don't want to say exclusively, because certainly it has a real kind of political meaning within the poem, but it is very much, this representation of politics has a lot to do with a representation of how the poetic tradition operates. And one of my basic principles is that you can think of the development of an oral tradition as a kind of collective decision-making process that unfolds over time. And on at each given performance, you can think of the performance as a kind of proposal as to how this tradition should be realized. And the response of the audience at each given performance will be a kind of approval or rejection of that particular version of the tradition. And over time, we have a whole sequence of performers and audiences making proposals, responding to them. It's that sequence that ultimately produces the Iliad as we know it. And I argue that that the representation of politics in the Iliad is, among other things, a way of reflecting on that collective decision-making process.
That's amazing. So, okay, this is why I say it's so beautiful. So, I know everyone's going to have questions, and we want to get to the focus passage. I just want to put one placeholder here. So, yes. Earlier you talked about this kind of consensus word as the ideal, and now you're talking about the way that it's associated with not just politics but reception, right? Which is a kind of word that you use frequently in your book. And so one of the things you say in your book is that the withholding of this kind of consensus is actually something that can drive the narrative of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so I'm interested in hearing more when we start to think about reception, about how the withholding of that idea of consensus can drive the continuing process of evolution of the poems themselves. But maybe we can jump into our focus passages first before we get too ahead.
Yeah, and I would also like to invite anybody who happens to be listening in to kind of jump in with questions or comments along the way, if we're technologically capable of doing that.
We are 100% capable of doing that. And in fact, we have our Q&A feature is live, so the people in our room here will be asking questions. So you'll see they're going to jump right in, and then we're going to invite the members of our community who are watching the live stream to submit questions as well. Okay, we probably won't be able to get to everything, but we'll do our best.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move to the passages now, and I'm actually going to start. Somebody's phone is ringing. I'm going to start with the second to last one, which is the passage from Scroll 23, lines 532 to 542. I just want to start here because this is the passage that actually got me started on this project. What's happening here, this comes from the famous chariot race scene in the funeral games for Patroclus. And the race has concluded, but there is about to be a dispute over the distribution of prizes. And of course that theme of a dispute over the distribution of prizes is a reprisal of the major themes that set the Iliad itself in motion. It's a kind of replay of Book 1. So it's very much connected up with the events that set the whole Iliad in motion. And here in this short passage that I chose as a focus passage, Achilles, at the conclusion of the race, makes a proposal for a particular distribution scheme. And what we'll find as the scene develops, it's not actually in my passage. Well, it's adumbrated in this passage, but Achilles' proposal, let's say, is ultimately fails because it threatens to deprive Antilochus, who actually finished second in the race, of his prize. So there's a question of depriving someone of a prize that he has apparently earned. And again, that's very much like the situation that Achilles finds himself in Book 1. So the lines I want to focus on here begin at around 535, and these are Achilles' words. He says, "The best man is coming in last. Let us give him a prize, for it is reasonable. He shall have the second." Remember, that's the prize that Antilochus should have been awarded. "But the first must go to the son of Tydeus." Thus did he speak. And the others, all of them, were expressing approval, and here's my key word, epaineîn, for his proposal. And here, next, we have this very interesting comment by the narrator. The narrator says, "And now he, Achilles, would have given him," that is, Eumelus, the son of Tydeus, "the horse, for the Achaeans had expressed approval." had not great-hearted Nestor's son Antilochus stood up and claimed his rights, etc., etc. What is so fascinating here is that the narrator himself comments on, let's say, the conventions of Homeric narration, and tells us very directly that this response of epaineîn should mean acting on the proposal. Because the Achaeans have expressed approval with this special verb, Achilles should, by rights, execute the proposal he has made. But someone objects, and that's kind of the moment where the initial consensus is disrupted. And it's disrupted for reasons that are entirely similar to the reasons that kind of created all the problems for the Achaeans back in Book 1. So this is the passage, and I read this passage, and when I read also the comments of a really brilliant Hellenist named Louis Gernet on this passage, this is what actually, it was kind of, this is the birth of the project right here in this passage. And I realized that this verb must contain you know, a kind of a key to unlocking a lot of what's going on in these scenes of collective decision making. So I read this passage and then decided, okay, I just have to understand how this verb fits into the themes of the poem, and the rest is kind of history. So I wanted to begin with that passage, and let me just pause to see if there are any questions or comments about that. Yes, I see a hand waving.
Oh, hi. Well, maybe now it's not the time, but it was about, I was really confused in this passage and also in the first one, scroll 1.
Yes.
About the behavior of the Achaeans as a group.
Yes.
Because Achilles says, well, forget about who won. I want to redistribute the prizes differently. And they always say, yay, and approval.
Yes.
Scroll 1, Chryses says, I want to, please accept the ransom. Achaeans go, yay, that's a great idea. Achilles says, send back, accept the ransom. They said, yay, it's a great idea. Agamemnon says something. The Achaeans say, yay, that's a great idea. And the Chryses they gave her, to Agamemnon in the first place.
Yeah.
They said, yay, this is a great idea. Let's give the priestess to Agamemnon. So I don't understand the behavior of the Achaeans. Is it that they just hear the loudest voice, the most authoritarian voice, and they are the madness of crowds? They're just agreeing. I wasn't really sure about where a group behavior and an individual behavior started and ended with this verb.
Okay, so I think it'll be helpful, and this is actually the next passage I wanted to look at was the Book 1 passage.
Okay, we can wait if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think it'll be helpful to look at that passage by way of answering the question. But one sort of issue that you're I think grappling with is, how is there a kind of well, I've been asked a couple of times when I've presented ideas from this book, is this collective decision-making process a rational process? That is, do we see people behaving as rational actors, and do we see the best arguments prevailing? That is a hard question to answer. I think the poem tends to say that the group usually gets things right, although that's not the case with the Trojans. The Trojans get things very wrong, and we'll see that in Book 18. But the Achaeans seem usually to be settling on the what the poem signals as the best outcome. Claudia, are we still okay? I saw a kind of funny message.
Yes, no, I was just adjusting a setting just so that the speakers will also come up on the main screen when the questioners will also come from the main screen. In fact, we also have another question from our audience who's beaming in.
Okay.
And they're asking, Laura Ford is asking, do we assume that epaineîn can be used only when there is unanimity, like a unanimous decision, right? But consensus is different from that, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Laura, for that question. So the passage we just looked at in Book 23 is very interesting, and I struggled a lot with this because the narrator tells us, well, they all gave this epaineîn response, but then there was an objection. So if you want epaineîn to signal consensus, it seems odd that it's used in this section where there's obviously a very vocal dissenter. And all I can say is that I think that's important. You know, it's important to show at this particular moment the way things ought to work in terms of the epaineîn response, and it's also important to show the disruption of that because it resonates with Book 1. I think if you look at the rest of the passages, so this one is a little bit of an exception, but I think it could be argued it's the exception that proves the rule. The rest of the instances of epaineîn in the poem, it really does seem to signal this verb a truly cohesive response of consensus. Now, Claudia pointed out consensus is different than unanimity, and that's a very important point. I think it's in part illustrated by another of the passages in my list that I hope we'll look at. But the difference here is that when groups arrive at a consensus, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in that group feels that the outcome is their preferred option. That is, if you asked everybody to vote for, you know, what option they want the most, you might still, even in a consensus situation, find a lot of differences of opinion. What consensus really means is that everyone in the group agrees that given the distribution of preferences, the outcome that is endorsed is the best possible outcome. That is, let's say it's not my preferred outcome, but I recognize that that you, Claudia, prefer that outcome so strongly that it would really be detrimental to our relationship in this group for me to obstruct that outcome. And I also recognize that in some future decision-making context where I have such a strong preference that you will defer to my preference because we are engaged in this long-term process of being members of the same group. So that's very different than unanimity, where kind of this assumption is everybody thinks this is the best outcome, and that's why this consensus model is a bit different than, let's say, majoritarian democratic practice, right? Okay, so thank you, Laura, for that question. I want to get back to Jackie's question, which has to do with kind of just how is the group of the Achaeans, behaving in all of these scenes, and what is their relationship with the leaders, let's say. So let's look now at the first passage on my list, which is Iliad, Book 1, lines 9 through 25. Actually, I see that
it's 1 through 25. Yeah.
1 through 25, right? But we can begin with line 9. So this is the description, really, of how the plot gets started. I suggest in the book that this is a kind of moment of disruption of equilibrium in the Achaean community that sets the whole poem in motion, and everything else is a consequence of this initial disruption of kind of the way things should be. So let's look at that moment starting in line 9. The singer has asked, the narrator has asked, who was it that set Agamemnon and Achilles on to quarrel with each other? And the answer we have, beginning in line 9, it was Apollo, the son of Leto and of Zeus. For he, that is Apollo, infuriated at the king, caused an evil disease to arise throughout the mass of warriors, and the people were getting destroyed because the son of Atreus had dishonored Chryses, his priest. Notice that the narrative, by the way, is kind of, at this moment, working backwards. So we begin from the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, and then the narrator is stepping back. Well, it was Apollo who started the quarrel by causing this plague, which was a consequence of the dishonoring of Chryses. We're moving back in time, kind of zeroing in on this crucial moment of disruption. And that comes next. Now, Chryses had come to the ship of the Achaeans to free his daughter, and had brought with him a great ransom. Moreover, he bore in his hand the scepter of Apollo, wreathed with a suppliant's wreath. And he besought the Achaeans, but most of all the two sons of Atreus, who were their chiefs. Sons of Atreus, he cried, and all other Achaeans, may the gods who dwell in Olympus grant you to destroy the city of Priam and to reach your homes in safety. But free my daughter and accept a ransom for her in reverence to Apollo, son of Zeus. So this is the request of the priest. And now we get this, and you could think of this as a kind of proposal made before a group for a collective decision, although there are some ambiguities here, okay? The narrator tells us around line 15, Chryses besought the Achaeans as a group, but most of all the two sons of Atreus. So there's an interesting ambiguity here. Who really is he addressing? Is it the Achaeans as a whole, or is it Agamemnon and Menelaus? I think that ambiguity is in a way intentional. It's part of the overall kind of disruption that happens at the beginning of the poem. That is, even politically, things are a little unclear here at this initial moment, and a large part of the work of the rest of the poem will be clarifying how things should work and arriving at a kind of more stable arrangement. So anyway, Chryses addresses the Achaeans as a group, and also the two sons of Atreus. And then the rest of the Achaeans, with one voice, expressed approval for respecting the priest. Now, the verb here is not my key verb epaineîn. It's a different verb, epaineîn. And interestingly, this is one of only two instances in the poem where this verb occurs. The only other instance is when Achilles re-narrates and actually re-speaks exactly these lines for Thetis later in this book, explaining what has happened. So this verb, epaineîn, is in a way, it means exactly one thing. It means the response that the Achaeans gave to Chryses on this one occasion. It's a kind of one-off word in the world of the Iliad. Okay, and that's very significant. We would expect to find, if things were working properly, we would expect to find that epaineîn response. But instead we find this other response, okay? So the Achaeans respond that way, and then the narrator tells us, but this did not please the heart of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, who spoke fiercely to him and sent him roughly away. So Agamemnon completely disregards the collective sentiment of the Achaeans, which is really unambiguously in favor of honoring Chryses' request. I would like to comment on this expression, it did not please the heart of Agamemnon, because in fact throughout the Iliad, this kind of expression with this verb handout, which means to please, signals, let's say, idiosyncratic preferences, the preferences of an individual that are very much in contrast with the preferences of the group. So the poetry is really setting up here a contrast between collective will of the Achaeans and the personal preference of Agamemnon, and is telling us that Agamemnon just follows his personal preference. Now, some commentators on the Iliad have said, well, this is evidence that in the world of Homeric politics, the king can do whatever he wants. He's not bound by the collective will of his community. That, to me, not only ignores this system of response formulas that I described earlier, but also ignores the rather obvious fact that things go very badly for Agamemnon when he acts in this way, when he acts unilaterally. So my argument in the book is that what is going on here is, I described it earlier as a kind of disruption of the way things ought to work. I use a more technical expression in the book. The expression is state of exception, which I take out of some work in political theory. But it's a kind of violation of the way that the Achaean community is, let's say, supposed to come to decisions, and that's why we have this substitution of this weird one-off verb epaineîn for the normal verb epaineîn, and it's also why Agamemnon just opts for his own preference. Jackie, did you have a follow-up?
Well, the follow-up, yeah. Do you think that that's purposeful, that verb, in that it irritates Agamemnon, and therefore he's going to react from a personal point of view in that he's not being respected? I mean, as where he thinks he should, and therefore he's not trusting. I think you put it as a deferred compensation. So he's not going to trust that he's going to get payback 3- or 4-fold, because now he's pissed because he's been disrespected as leader. And there you get that tension again of leader making decisions or judgments which may or may not be in the cause of justice for the good. So that's interesting. Really, I did not catch that verb approval. Thanks. That was fun to hear.
But that's a great point, Jackie. And so one question you're raising is, okay, when there's a different verb to describe the response of the community, does it mean that response is unsatisfactory in some way? And
Rome is provoking.
Yeah, and I prefer to read that verb in this scene as a signal, simply as a kind of signal on the part of the narrator that things are not working properly.
Okay.
Okay. But one of the difficulties here is, and I described this in the book, this is a real interpretive difficulty, is that since this verb only occurs in this context, a professional Homerist might use this rather obscure phrase, hapax legomenon, which means a word that is used only once in the corpus. I said it's used twice, but in the same line, so effectively only once. That makes it almost impossible to kind of figure out what it really means, because you have no other context with which to compare it. So that's a kind of interpretive difficulty, which I actually, in the book, argue is a very interesting and significant difficulty. It's part of this atmosphere of ambiguity that characterizes this initial scene. But it's worth thinking about. And then your other point, which is a very good one, is that aren't the Achaeans simply kind of undoing what they had already done before? Isn't that a slight to Agamemnon? Certainly, that's the argument that Achilles makes, right? He says, "Well, you've awarded me Briseis. You can't take her away now." And there is, I think, probably something to that. But the problem is that this scene is also a request for ransom. So Chryses has come to ransom his daughter, and in a book called I think it's called Ransom and Revenge in the Iliad by Donna Wilson. I may have the title slightly wrong. I'm sure somebody out there will correct me. She shows that outside the period described by the Iliad, so when there are references within the Iliad to events prior to the Iliad's primary narrative, these requests for ransom are, as a rule, accepted. It's almost a convention of this society that when someone comes to you and offers epaineîn, this ransom, you are expected to honor that. So there is, yes, this problem that aren't the Achaeans undoing what they've already done, but on the other hand, they are simply supporting what really should be done in such situations, which is that the Chryses should be able to ransom his daughter. So I hope that, again, it's such a complicated scene. This is so fascinating. There are so many angles to consider here. Those are a couple of them, and I hope that they address or connect up with some of the things that you were noticing there.
So, this is so beautiful, and I love just reading these passages slowly, but I just want to take note, we have about 15 minutes left. So
Yes.
how do no, I don't think we should rush, actually. I think we should continue just as we're doing, but my question is, where should we go next? What do you think?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. I really want to talk, I think we can skip the scroll 18 passage. I want to talk about the scroll 3 to 4 passage because I just think it's fun. And then I want to talk about the scroll 24 passage, okay?
Great.
And I'll try not to read through the passages as slowly as I have so far.
No. I think it's beautiful.
Well, these are long passages, though. So, okay, let's switch to scroll 3, line 455 through scroll 4, line 67. So notice I've asked you to kind of look across the break between scrolls. That's because this is one of the great cliffhanger moments in the Iliad, okay? So what's happened at the end of book 3, or scroll 3, as I know the students in Greg's course like to refer to the sections of the Iliad. So at the end of scroll 3, there's been this duel between Menelaus and Alexander, or Paris, to kind of decide the fate of the Trojan War in some ways. The terms of the duel were that the winner should take Helen and take the goods that had accompanied Helen to Troy, and that should be the ending of the conflict. So this is very much about, can we find an alternative to all-out war, to ending this? Now, the duel has again ended it somewhat ambiguously, because Aphrodite has spirited Paris away at the moment at which it appeared he was about to be killed. So in a sense, although Menelaus has won a technical victory, there's no decisive outcome. Agamemnon offers an interpretation where my passage begins. Agamemnon offers an interpretation of the outcome of this duel, which is, of course, in his own favor. He says, well, Menelaus has won. And he makes what is, again, in essence, a proposal. He says, therefore, the Trojans should give back Helen with all her wealth and to pay this penalty that they had spoken of earlier. And at the last line of scroll 3 is one of these response formulas. And it is, very, very interestingly, my epaineîn response. So line 461, thus spoke the son of Atreus, and the Achaeans shouted in approval, epaineîn. Now, that verb elsewhere always signals a successful proposal, a proposal that is put into action. Of course, in this case, it isn't, because if it were put into action, there would be no destruction of Troy. The Trojan War would end here. One of the interesting things, we'll see in a moment kind of what happens as the scene develops, but one of the interesting things to ponder in this is that the proposal that Agamemnon has made concerns two groups, the Achaeans and the Trojans, but the response given is restricted to the Achaeans. So a question you might ask is, can one group come to a decision that has consequences for more than one group? That's one question that's kind of raised here. Now, this is a great cliffhanger moment because, as I said, that epaineîn response should mean that the proposal is put into effect. So we get to the end of scroll 3 and we kind of think, what's going to happen? I mean, we know that the Trojan War can't end this way, so what's going to happen? It's a kind of cliffhanger effect. And then we get carried over into scroll 4, where the scene immediately switches to Olympus and a discussion that is kind of underway among the gods on Olympus. And here, essentially, the Olympians take up the question that has been raised by the conclusion to scroll 3. I suppose that you could think of this as kind of, appeal to a higher court of this decision. So Zeus says, what do you think? Should we not allow Menelaus to take back Helen And then the city of Priam may remain still uninhabited. That's around line 19 in scroll 4. Zeus seems really to be advocating for this kind of outcome. And he encounters some pretty strong objections, especially from Hera. And I just want to draw your attention here to about line 25 to 29. Hera says, in reply to Zeus's proposal, "Dread son of Kronos, what is the meaning of all this? Is my trouble then to go for nothing, and the sweat that I have sweated, to say nothing of my horses, while getting the people together against Priam?" Are you still with me? A message popped up on my screen. Okay, good, sorry. Continuing with Hera's words, this is the crucial line. "Do as you will," she says, "but we other gods shall not all of us approve your counsel, epaineîn." Now, I have to point out here that some commentators on this passage have said, well, clearly Zeus could, if he wanted to, impose the solution that he has proposed, because Hera says, "Do as you will." So clearly Zeus must be able to do that. But I think you have to attend more closely to the rhetoric here. She says, go ahead if you want, but we're not going to approve. That is really a very substantive threat. It's not made directly, but she's basically saying you can try to act on this proposal, but it's not going to be successful in the long term. Go ahead if you want, give it a shot, but you're not really going to be able to carry through with this. And Zeus, of course, immediately recognizes that. And he goes on to kind of negotiate with Hera over, he capitulates. He says, okay, fine, we'll let the war continue. But listen, Hera, when you want to destroy one of my favorite cities, you've got to be more accommodating. And that's where we, actually get into the kinds of negotiation that characterize consensus as a particular form of decision making, as opposed to, let's say, majoritarian democracy, where it's just, can we get enough votes to do this, right? That's, in a nutshell, what I wanted to say about that passage. And I think maybe, unless there are, I'm happy to take a question or comment on that passage. I'm also happy to move on to the last passage on my list. Would anyone like to pose a comment, question? No, I don't. Not seeing any.
No, I think it's great. I'm sure people have questions, but I think we want to get to our next passage because it brings it all together, I think, in a beautiful way. And then we do have a question in the chat bar at the end from the Q&A.
Okay.
One of our participants, Steve Duke, if we can take one of his questions, that would be great. Okay. So let's move forward.
So very quickly, let me just do the last passage, Iliad 24. I wanted to read this. This is, of course, the funeral for Hector and the lamentations that are performed for Hector. This is important to my argument that the representation of politics in the poem is actually, at least in part, directed towards commenting on the way the poetic tradition works. This scene of the performance of these laments for Hector, what we find is that each lamentation, and there's one by Hecabe, there's one by Andromache, and there's one by Helen of Troy. Each performance is followed by a collective response. And at the end of the poem, the poem is really punctuated by these scenes of collective response. And I've talked so far just about collective decision-making scenes. But what we find very interestingly at the end of the poem is that there's a shift away from these political types of interaction towards these poetic interactions. And in fact, the phraseology of response, in reaction to these performances of laments, they're precisely analogous to the phrases used in these response formulas in collective decision-making scenes. That's an argument I make in the later chapters of the book. But I want to draw your attention to the way these responses work. First, we have Andromache lamenting for Hector. And when she finishes, I'm trying to find the exact line, it's around line 745. We see this formula formulaic expression, thus did she speak, lamenting, and the women groaned in response. Epaineîn. There's another one of these epi verbs. And the whole phrase, actually, in Greek looks very similar to the phrases that have been used to describe collective response in political contexts. So the women groaned in response. Then Hecabe or Hecuba gives her performance, and there is again a response. But what is most interesting is the last performance, Helen's performance, and we see my passage ends with the response to that performance. Again, one of these formulaic expressions for response. Thus did she speak, lamenting, and the boundless epeineîn, that's the word for boundless, people, the demos, groaned in response. Epaineîn. Again, one of these epi verbs. What's fascinating is that, you know, we go from the women groaning in response to the boundless people. There is this kind of expanding circle of response and endorsement for this poetic performance. And I really think that that figures in that expanding circle, and this image of the boundless people figures kind of the ever-expanding audience for the Iliad. The Iliad is really, in a sense, imagining all of the people who at one time or another will be asked, invited to respond to this poetry. And that's how the Iliad ends, by, in a way, inviting us to respond to this beautiful poem. So I had to compress my remarks a bit on this passage, but I think I've given you the sense of what I do with that passage in the book. Now, I hope we have time for at least one, maybe two questions.
Yeah. Please, I hope someone will ask a question. Sarah or Janet or Jack?
No?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. It took me a second to unmute myself. Well, I'm working on the idea of choice and decision in Homer and later Greek literature. By way of introduction, I studied with Snell in Hamburg years ago.
Wow.
And he provocatively said that, well, there's no word for decision in Homer, so I've come to the conclusion that he didn't have it. Of course, he meant by decision, he meant, a subjective, Sichentscheiden, reflected decision, as opposed to, say, Dikadzo, where, like if Achilles decides who's going to, or a Peirar in the Shield of Achilles,
Right.
the result of deliberation. So I think we need to distinguish subjective and objective decision. I guess my big question is, well, to refer to the literature a little bit, is Jane right? Is Julian Jaynes and his idea about the development of reflected consciousness or meta-consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, do we see it in front of us in the Homeric epic?
So I have to say, I don't have a view on this question. That's a disappointing answer. I almost deliberately didn't engage in this question of kind of the what Homeric poetry can tell us about the development of consciousness or ways of thinking. The question of psychology. That was too distant, really, from my core concerns to be something that I really wanted to get involved with in this book. So I haven't given it a great deal of thought. I mean, my concern with the approach of using the Homeric poems as a way of reconstructing a particular stage in the development of, a collective consciousness or even an individual consciousness is my difficulty with that is that I think the poem the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think the poems both reflect such a long period of development that they can't really be pinned down to one particular historical moment. You know, it's too fuzzy a picture to get you back to a particular even century. So I think that, for me, that's a kind of methodological problem with I mean, one has to be very careful then using these poems in that way. That's not a satisfying answer to your question, Jack, which I think is an interesting one. But that's my position.
I think it needs further study, and if we can, you know, how you've involved other disciplines in your focus on the poetry, and I think that you know, we can learn things from neuropsychologists on that help us understand why it resonates so well. I mean, the Homeric poetry resonates.
Yeah.
I know a lot of it is because it was fine-tuned over centuries of proposals and responses, such as you say. Anyway, I think you've a brilliant book, and I like to stick to the you know, getting started and always come back to the, you know, what do we have from Homer, and what does it say to us as poetry? And the other part is, you know, well, I mean, is it coming from a, you know, a different, we know it's coming from a different culture, obviously, but, you know, is there something in
Jack, you know what, I'm so sorry to interrupt, Jack. You know, I just noticed it's 12:01, and I do know that Professor Elmer has a very hard stop. Actually, he has to attend to another thing. So I
have another thing I have to go to, but I mean, we can go for a few more minutes. So, but I want to make sure that I want to thank Jack, and I couldn't agree more about the potential for neuroscience to illuminate all kinds of interesting questions. Although I should say that my wife is a philosopher of mind, and she has real difficulty actually with the way that some of the ways that neuroscience is currently. So I have to be careful about how far I go in that direction. But I want to see, Claudia, are there other questions from the community that we can pick up, or?
So there are a few. So maybe David, can you, if you move your cursor over to left-hand side, can you see the questions in the Q&A app? Do you see the little blue button that says Q&A?
Oh, I do. Oh my goodness. Wait. Do I? No, I don't. Oh, yes. Wait, no.
Okay.
What I see is, I see a sidebar.
Okay, so I'll read a couple, okay? So okay. Steve Yuk, who's actually a very active member of our community, has given us a couple of questions and comments. We won't have time for them all, but he's interested in thinking about, he asked questions about, does epaineîn exclude objection? I think we've dealt with that a little bit.
Yeah.
And then he asked, how is tradition in decision-making established through epic language? So this takes us towards sort of the second half of your book. Do we simply look for words as signs that signal consensus? Does the word epaineîn always mean consensus? I think you've sort of dealt with that a little bit. Yeah. And how is objection addressed?
Yeah. Okay. So Steve, now I see the Q&A things now. So my approach has been to start from this vocabulary and then to trace it. Now, it's not just, I've been doing a very clumsy job of doing that in this discussion. The way I do it, you know, in the book is, I hope, very nuanced and careful. And it involves reading this terminology in context and really thinking about what these scenes are really mean. I mean, one way in which I get from politics to poetry is by noting, for example, that when the Olympians engage in these collective decision-making scenes, they are really talking about the shape of the Iliadic tradition. It's a very metapoetic kind of discussion. It's political only in a narrow sense. So that's an important consideration there.
And you even say in that part of the book, I think, you say that the Olympians sort of stand in, or sort of a stand-in for the wider audience.
Yeah,
ways,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
And by the way, Sorry, I should add. There's a little bit in one of the last chapters about the way that Plato picks up on this motif, and it turns out that Plato in the Republic, Book 2, uses these scenes of divine deliberation precisely as a way of commenting on the reshaping of the Iliadic tradition in the context of his ideal state. So Plato sees this motif, in exactly the way that I'm talking about, which makes me feel a little more confident in my views here.
And in fact, Steve Yuke in another comment has honored your important work, very scientific work in terms of explaining pari and applying that that methodology. So you're definitely appreciated on that front. And then we have a question from Georgios from Greece. He says, "Warm greetings from Greece." Lucky man.
I bet they are warmer than Boston, yes.
Could you make a comment concerning the relation of epaineîn as a notion regarding mortals to the original eineinein with a similar meaning concerning the gods? Could we then draw a parallel between these two concepts in the Iliad? I don't know if there's time. Do you have time for this?
Yes, but I may not answer it exactly in the way that that Georgios wants me to answer it. So I have a chapter that deals with the etymology of these words, and kind of starting from ainos, the root here, the noun from which we get these verbs, and I would basically, it's a long discussion and it's hard to summarize, but the basic idea is that at its core, this notion of ainos, which is a word for a certain kind of utterance, it signals an utterance that has social consequences. We might call it a speech act and invoke kind of the broader network of speech act theory. And so eineinein and epaineîn, yes, they're very, very closely related. I think the difference in the Iliad between these two words is really a matter of their contextual restriction or non-restriction. So the verb eineinein is much less restricted than epaineîn. What I mean to say is that it's not necessarily that the lexeme epaineîn means something very different from the lexeme eineinein. They both means, well, actually, let me step back from that. Etymologically, eineinein should mean to make one of these socially consequential remarks, and epaineîn should mean something like respond to that socially consequential utterance, right? So it's a bit like the words designate the response, sorry, the utterance and the response. That's not a hard and fast rule because, we see in Pindar, for example, that epaineîn can mean the utterance of Pindaric poetry. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but that's how it tends to work in the Iliad. And that has a lot to do with just the contextual distribution of these two words. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through all of this because, as I explained to Claudia, I am supposed to be somewhere else now. So that was a bit confused, but I hope I've sketched out kind of how I would go about answering Georgios's question.
Yeah, I actually think that's very beautiful, and I think it's in Chapter 2 that you discuss this in depth. We would highly recommend people to do that, to take a look at the book and to read it very thoroughly. And our community is going to continue the conversation. Now, David, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your time. I hope you'll come back to us and meet with us to talk more about your work with the Milman Parry collection and South Slavic epic.
I would love to. It was a pleasure to meet all of the people whose pictures I can see at the bottom of the screen, and to read the comments from various people out there in the broader community. So thank you so much, to all of you.
And we'll be sharing this conversation through recording with the boundless audience. Okay?
Yes, right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, Dave.